Nineveh was an ancient Mesopotamian city located in modern-day Iraq. It is on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, and was the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It was the largest city in the world for some 50 years until, after a bitter period of civil war in Assyria itself, it was sacked by an unusual coalition of former subject peoples, the Babylonians, Medes, Persians, Chaldeans, Scythians and Sumerians in 612 BC. Its ruins are across the river from the modern-day major city of Mosul, in the Nineveh Governorate of Iraq. The two main tells, or mound ruins, within the walls are Kouyunjik, the northern palace, and Tel Nabi Yunus. Name: the English place name Nineveh comes from Latin Nineveh and Septuagint Greek Nini under influence of the biblical Hebrew Nineveh, itself from the Akkadian Ninua or Old Babylonian Ninua. The original meaning of the name is unclear, but may have referred to a patron goddess. The cuneiform for Nina is a fish within a house. This may have simply intended place of fish, or may have indicated her goddess associated with fish or the river itself, possibly originally of Hurran origin. The city was later said to be devoted to the Ishtar of Nineveh, and Nina was one of the Babylonian names of that goddess. The city was also known as Nini or Ni in ancient Egyptian, Ninua in Mari, Ninawa in Aramaic, in Syriac, and Nineveh in Persian. Nabi Yunus is the Arabic for Prophet Jonah. Kouyunjik was, according to Layard, a Turkish name, and it was known as Amashir by the Arabs, and is thought to have some connection with the Kara-Koyunlu dynasty. Geography: the remains of ancient Nineveh are the mound ruins of Kouyunjik and Nabi Yunus are located on a level part of the plain near the junction of the Tigris and the Khosr rivers within an area of 750 hectares circumscribed by a 12-kilometer brick rampart. This whole extensive space is now one immense area of ruins overlaid in parts by new suburbs of the city of Mosul. Nineveh was an important junction for commercial routes crossing the Tigris, occupying a central position on the Great Highway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean, thus uniting the East and the West. It received wealth from many sources, so that it became one of the greatest of all the region's ancient cities, and the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. History: Nineveh was one of the oldest and greatest cities in antiquity. The area was settled as early as 6000 BC and, by 3000 BC, had become an important religious center for worship of the Akkadian goddess Ishtar. The early city were constructed on a fault line and, consequently, suffered damage from a number of earthquakes. One such event destroyed the first temple of Ishtar, which was then rebuilt in 2260 BC by the Akkadian king Menishtosu. Texts from the Hellenistic period and later offered an eponymous Ninus as the founder of Nineveh, although there is no historical basis for this. The historic Nineveh is mentioned during the reign of Shamshi-Adad I in about 1800 BC as a center of worship of Ishtar, whose cult was responsible for the city's early importance. The goddess's statue was sent to Pharaoh Amenhotep III of Egypt in the 14th century BC, by orders of the king of Mitanni. The Assyrian city of Nineveh became one of Mitanni's vassals for half a century until the early 14th century BC, when the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal reclaimed it in 1365 BC while overthrowing the Mitanni Empire and creating the Middle Assyrian Empire. There is no large body of evidence to show that Assyrian monarchs built at all extensively in Nineveh during the 2nd millennium BC. It appears to have been originally an Assyrian provincial town. Later monarchs whose inscriptions have appeared on the high city include Shalmaneser I and Tiglath-Pileser I, both of whom were active builders in Ashur. Nineveh had to wait for the Neo-Assyrian Empire, particularly from the time of Ashurnasirpal II onward, for a considerable architectural expansion. Thereafter successive monarchs such as Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal kept in repair and founded new palaces, temples to Sin, Ashur, Nergal, Shamash, Ninurta, Ishtar, and Nabir of Borsippa. It was Sennacherib who made Nineveh a truly magnificent city. He laid out new streets and squares and built within it the famous palace without a rival, the plan of which has been mostly recovered and has overall dimensions of about 503 by 242 meters. It comprised at least 80 rooms, many of which were lined with sculpture. A large number of cuneiform tablets were found in the palace. The solid foundation was made out of limestone blocks and mud bricks. It was 22 meters tall. In total, the foundation is made of roughly 2,680,000 cubic meters of brick. The walls on top, made out of mud brick, were an additional 20 meters tall. Some of the principal doorways were flanked by colossal stone dwarf figures weighing up to 30,000 kilograms. They included many winged lions or bulls, with a man's head. These were transported 50 kilometers from quarries at Balatai, and they had to be lifted up 20 meters once they arrived at the site, presumably by a ramp. There are also 3,000 meters of stone panels carved in bas-relief that include pictorial records documenting every construction step, including carving the statues and transporting them on a barge. One picture shows 44 men towing a colossal statue. The carving shows 3 men directing the operation while standing on the colossus. Once the statues arrived at their destination, the final carving was done. Most of the statues weigh between 9,000 and 27,000 kilograms. The stone carvings in the walls include many battle scenes, impalings and scenes showing Sennacherib's men parading the spoils of war before him. He also bragged about his conquests. He wrote of Babylon and Hezekiah of Judah, who had not submitted to my yoke. Him I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a caged bird. Earthworks I threw up against him, and anyone coming out of his city gate I made pay for his crime. His cities which I had plundered I had cut off from his land. At this time, the total area of Nineveh comprised about 7 square kilometers, and 15 great gates penetrated its walls. An elaborate system of 18 canals brought water from the hills to Nineveh, and several sections of a magnificently constructed aqueduct erected by Sennacherib were discovered at Jerwin, about 65 kilometers distant. Some scholars believe that the garden which Sennacherib built next to his palace, with its associated irrigation works, comprised the original hanging gardens of Babylon. Nineveh's greatness was short-lived. In around 627 BC, after the death of its last great king Ashurbanipal, the Neo-Assyrian Empire began to unravel due to a series of bitter civil wars. And in 616 BC Assyria was attacked by its former vassals, the Babylonians, Chaldeans, Medes, Persians, Scythians and Cimmerians. In about 616 BC Kalu was sacked. The allied forces eventually reached Nineveh, besieging and sacking the city in 612 BC, following bitter house-to-house fighting, after which it was razed to the ground. Most of the people in the city who could not escape to the last Assyrian strongholds in the north and west were either massacred or deported out of the city and into the countryside. Many unburied skeletons were found by the archaeologists at the site. The Assyrian Empire then came to an end by 605 BC, the Medes and Babylonians dividing its colonies between them. Following the defeat in 612 BC, the site remained largely unoccupied for centuries, with only a scattering of Assyrians living amid the ruins until the Sasanian period. Although Assyrians continue to live in the surrounding area to this day, the city is mentioned again in the Battle of Nineveh in 627 AD, which was fought between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire of Persia near the ancient city. From the Arab conquest in 637 AD until the modern period, The city of Mosul on the opposite bank of the river Tigris became the successor of ancient Nineveh. Biblical Nineveh. In the Hebrew Bible, Nineveh is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 10 verse 11. Ashur left that land, and built Nineveh. Some modern English translations interpret Ashur in the Hebrew of this verse as the country, Assyria, rather than a person, thus making Nimrod, rather than Ashur, the founder of Nineveh. Nineveh was the flourishing capital of the Assyrian Empire, and was the home of King Sennacherib, king of Assyria. During the biblical reign of King Hezekiah and the lifetime of Judean prophet Isaiah, as recorded in Hebrew scripture, Nineveh was also the place where Sennacherib died at the hands of his 2 sons, who then fled to the vassal land of Urartu. The book of the prophet Nahum is almost exclusively taken up with prophetic denunciations against Nineveh. Its ruin and utter desolation are foretold. Its end was strange, sudden, and tragic. According to the Bible, it was God's doing, his judgment on Assyria's pride. In fulfillment of prophecy, God made an utter end of the place. It became a desolation. The prophet Zephaniah also predicts its destruction along with the fall of the empire of which it was the capital. Nineveh is also the setting of the Book of Tobit. The Book of Jonah, set in the days of the Assyrian Empire, describes it as an exceedingly great city of 3 days' journey in breadth, whose population at that time is given as more than 120,000. But it is also possible that it took 3 days to cover all its neighborhoods by walking, which would match the size of ancient Nineveh. The ruins of Kouyunjik, Nimrud, Karamla and Khorsabad form the 4 corners of an irregular quadrangle. The ruins of Nineveh, with the whole area included within the parallelogram they form by lines drawn from the one to the other, are generally regarded as consisting of these 4 sites. The Book of Jonah depicts Nineveh as a wicked city worthy of destruction. God sent Jonah to preach to the Ninevites of their coming destruction, and they fasted and repented because of this. As a result, God spared the city. When Jonah protests against this, God states he is showing mercy for the population who are ignorant of the difference between right and wrong, and mercy for the animals in the city. Nineveh's repentance and salvation from evil is noted in the Christian biblical canons Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. To this day, Oriental churches of the Middle East commemorate the 3 days Jonah spent inside the fish during the fast of Nineveh. The Christians observing this holiday fast by refraining from food and drinks. Churches encourage followers to refrain from meat, fish and dairy products. Classical history. Before the great archaeological excavations in the 19th century, there was almost no historical knowledge of the great Assyrian Empire and of its magnificent capital. Other cities that had perished, such as Palmyra, Persepolis, and Thebes, had left ruins to mark their sites and tell of their former greatness, but of this city, Imperial Nineveh, not a single vestige seemed to remain, and the very place on which it had stood became only a matter of conjecture. In the days of the Greek historians Ctesias and Herodotus, 400 BC, Nineveh had become a thing of the past, and when Xenophon the historian passed the place in the retreat of the 10,000, the very memory of its name had been lost. It was buried out of sight. In his History of the World, Sir Walter Raleigh erroneously asserted that Nineveh had originally had the name Campsor before Ninus supposedly rebuilt it. This was still regarded as correct information when news of Layard's discoveries reached the West.